Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build another locomotive, this time the Hobby Boss German Kriegslokomotive BR52 in 1/72nd scale. The box doesn't give us a whole lot of information beyond the scale, dimensions of the model and the parts count, which is 281 parts, but that is enough information for impulse buying Herbert Erpaderp. There's nothing on the back of the box. That's fine. At least the front looks cool. I'm not very knowledgeable about German locomotives, but I believe this is an iteration of the Class 50 built during World War II that used less parts and could be built more cheaply. At any rate, we're not here for a history lesson and this is going to be a long one, so buckle up, friendo. Inside the box we can see that there's a whole bunch of sprues and everything comes wrapped in its own bag. A bit wasteful, but I guess it could be worse. If you count things like the frame and the tender body as their own sprues, there are 11 total in this box. Some of them, like the wheels and the display base sprues, are duplicated. I'm not going to go into depth with all these parts because we'd be here all day, but I'll still give you a brief look. The plastic these sprues are made from is a little bit soft, but I don't think that's really going to be an issue. It does mean that you should take care with some of the small thin parts. I suspect they'll be easy to accidentally damage, but as long as you're mindful of that and careful with what you do while building, it shouldn't be an issue. This is not a gaming piece, so it being relatively soft compared to hard plastic tanks and such shouldn't really matter. Once it's built, it'll probably just sit on a shelf and won't be handled regularly. Looking through all of these parts, you can see that they're fairly crisp and neat looking, and there's a fair bit of detail here. We can also see that there is no shortage of mold lines and there's some flashing in a couple of places that's a bit annoying, but I wouldn't say it's really extreme and should be pretty quick and easy to remove. Some of you might remember the big boy model I did a while ago, and compared to that, the parts for the Kriegslokomotive look much nicer and neater. It does also look a bit more complicated, but I'm feeling up to that challenge. Along with all the plastic sprues, you get this. You thought rubber tracks were bad, this is worse. We'll talk about this later. We also get this sheet of window glass, which is nice. I like that it's got markings to allow it to be cut to the appropriate size. Inside the same little baggie are the decals. I'm going to leave these in the bag until I need them, so I can't really see if they look good or not. They do exist though, so that's something. Would it surprise you that a kit like this comes with instructions? No? I guess that would be silly. There is a separate instruction sheet for the display stand. I guess that might be included in multiple kits, so that does make sense. There's also a separate painting guide. The camo pattern at the bottom is kind of interesting. And of course there are instructions for the locomotive itself. These are, for the most part, fairly easy to understand and follow. There were a couple of points where I found myself guessing or having to refer to a picture, but not too often. Also, some of the steps are a bit dense. I guess that's a good word for it, but I suppose that's not really a bad thing. Just pay attention so that you don't miss out any of the parts. I figure I might as well begin where the instructions want me to, and that's making the front buffer beam. I guess that's what you would call it anyway. It's made up of 3 parts. I glue the top part on first. These parts are keyed so that they go together pretty easily, though because I'm a bit of a numpty, mine didn't go together perfectly. Oh well, I glue it onto the front of the frame anyway. The front of the frame has those little arches on either side. The buffer beam assembly should have those little things poking out at the bottom. Not a bad start. Might as well add the buffers next, right? Be sure to use the right parts here. They're both slightly different. One buffer is flat, and the other has a slightly domed shape to it. These go on pretty easily owing to the keying, but you might want to make sure the previous part is glued on properly before adding these. The flat one should go on the locomotive's left and the other on the right. I'm not sure of the reason for this, but it is kind of interesting. Next, we install the drawbar for the tender. This should be installed on this plate, facing away from those 2 little square bits with the holes in them. It then goes into the bottom of the engine frame like so, obviously at the rear where the tender will connect. I then install this plate. It goes on the underside of the frame near the front, and that round mounting hole should face towards the rear of the engine. Now it's time for some suspension. These are some of the thin, easily broken parts that I mentioned before. It's a little bit fiddly to attach. The mounting pins kind of alternate back and forth between going on the front and the back of the suspension part. I hope that makes sense because I couldn't think of a better way to phrase it. There are 4 sections of this stuff, and it all pretty much goes on the same way. I ended up leaving the mold lines on most of these suspension parts because I didn't think they would be all that visible, and I didn't really want to break them. Next, I assembled this box, whatever you might call it. This is fairly simple to put together. There is keying so that you don't have to worry about getting the parts too high or too low. All you've got to do is try and get them as close to 90 degrees as you can. I've obviously eyeballed it, but if you really wanted you could use a straight edge or something to make sure all of the angles are perfect. I set that aside to allow the glue to bond properly, and then I attached this plate to the rear of the engine frame. This is simple. The part is keyed, so it's hard to get this wrong, though obviously make sure you've put it up the right way like so. Then some more suspension-y bits can go on towards the front of the frame. These slot down into the rectangular hole and onto this mounting pin. I added the glue after I figured how they should sit. Nothing too hard here. Then comes this set of steam pipes which sit like so. The notch in their mounting pegs should be facing towards the rear. Then we can add the box I assembled a short while ago. It goes over the steam pipe I just put in. The lower part of this box should sit inside the frame. I apply a bit of pressure and it's nicely in place. The opening should face towards the rear of the engine. Now let's turn this pile of stuff into something. First, what looks to be a crank of some kind goes on. This bar has thinner sections at either end, but one of them is a bit longer, and that's the one the crank goes on, as you see here. Then I add two brackety things. I don't glue them to the bar because I figured that will make things difficult or impossible later on. I then glue a pair of brackets onto either side of this plate part. I put these on because the instructions kind of made it look like they needed to be there for the parts that I just put together, but they don't, and it would probably have been easier to add these afterwards. Oh well. I then glue on one of the brackety things I added to the bar part, and then the one on the other end. I did this one at a time to avoid making a mess with the glue. Looks neat enough. There are two other crank things that go on either end of the bar, but like the inner one, I think these are going to need to be moved later in the assembly, so I leave them loose. One of them is tight enough to stay there with friction alone, but the other one was a bit loose, so I was extra careful not to lose that part. That assembly then slots onto this frame piece. It goes at the end slot furthest away from the two pointy bits. Then come the rest of these. I guess you would call them frame parts? I don't know. This is not especially challenging, just make sure that you're putting the correct parts in the correct place. That entire assembly can then go into the frame. This was a bit fiddly. There's quite a bit of flex in the parts and it was kind of hard to get them to go down into the frame. I did get there eventually though. I then put this rectangular thing in place here. There's a couple of notches to help you get the positioning of this right. Then I add two support plate things. There's one of these for either side of the box with the steam pipes. I glue these on as straight as I can, hoping that they'll line up neatly with whatever they support. There's another two that go onto the side of the frame near where the cab will be. They go in front of that hole in the frame like so. Again, I tried to get them on nice and straight. Now it's time to make the drive cylinders. Maybe there's a better name for those. I don't know it though. These aren't especially hard to put together. The main cylinder assembly is the same for either side of the locomotive, so you don't need to worry about that too much until you add these disc things, whatever they're called. One of them has a pointy bit which will face towards the front of the engine, while the other has a hole in it. As long as you're paying attention and you don't glue them on the same side, things should be fine. Then we have these things. They're made of two parts and have little guide pins to make it easy to line them up neatly. These are actually mislabeled in the instructions, but it's not hard to figure out which parts you need to use. Once they're glued together, we can join them to the cylinders we just made. I had to do a fair bit of trimming and sanding to get this to fit, but that's not too hard to do. As you can see, at this point the little discs with the protrusions are about all that determines which part of the cylinder assembly is forwards, so you don't want to have two that are exactly the same. Then, at the rear of the frame I add these brake cylinders. I'm pretty sure that's what these are anyway. They mount into a slot just behind that circular opening, and as you can see, there's one for each side. Then comes this bracket, I guess you might call it. It should protrude out over the right side of the frame. I then join the driver cylinders to the frame. These go on easily enough. Just be sure to put them on the correct side of the frame, which, as I assume I said before, is with the pointy bits towards the front. Now for some different cylinders. These are, I assume, air cylinders for the braking systems. There are two of these and they're different sizes, but both of them go together the same way, with some little guide pins to help line things up nicely. They didn't go together perfectly though, and I did have to clean the ends up a bit. Nothing too drastic though. Both cylinders have bracket things to mount them to the frame, and they're different for either cylinder, so be sure that you're using the correct parts when doing this. Installation is simple enough. The bracket parts should fit around the frame and slide down a little bit, and there are notches to help guide their placement. You can see one sits a little bit higher than the other. I'm not 100% sure I've placed these properly, but they look fine, so they're probably okay. Next, I build a pair of, I guess they're little plows. There are 2 of these, one for each side, and they go together fairly easily, though I did have to nudge them around a fair bit until they looked straight. Then I set them aside so the glue can set while I install these hooky bar things. Whatever they're called, they're part of the engine's brakes. These slot into the holes on either side of the frame here, but I don't want to glue them into place because that will almost certainly cause issues installing the rest of the braking system later. What I did was add a bit of glue to join these parts together in the middle so they should stay together and not fall out of the frame, while still being movable. This should make things a lot easier later. Then, why not install the plough things I just assembled? There's a little square mounting hole for these on either side of the frame just in front of the arch things. Then I add the steps. There are notches on the underside of the buffer beam for these to mount onto. They needed a fair bit of nudging until they looked straight and good. Next comes it's not a truck, I guess the mounting thing for the forward wheel. I like how this kind of hooks into the axle. There's a pin to make sure it stays there too. If I did this again, I would probably not glue this into place until I'd got the wheels on so that I could be sure they were all at the proper height. Hindsight is 20/20, I guess. I then added these air hoses, assuming this locomotive used an air braking system and not a vacuum one. These were actually a bit more fiddly than I thought they would be. Also, I had to expand the mounting holes for them a bit, but they went on in the end and I guess that's what matters. Then the instructions say to build the cab, so why not? I start by joining this box to the inside of the right wall of the cab. The instructions also say to add the window glazings here, but I feel like that should come after the painting, so I left them off. I then joined the left cab wall to the front. This is easy enough, though there isn't really much to guide it, so it's easy to get it all wonky. I found putting the floor in at this stage helped getting things lined up nice and neatly. I let it set for a bit and then I added the right cab side. It's obviously simple stuff. Next, I build the back end of the firebox. There's probably a better name for it than that, but I'm no steam locomotive scientist, so I wouldn't know. First, I add the firebox door part. I think it would be kind of cool if there was an option to model this open, but this is fine. I then add this part, which is a mounting for a control wheel. After that comes this set of gauges. This slots neatly into the hole intended for it. It's a fairly tight fit, so it may actually stay there with friction, but it's a better idea to add some glue, really. Then comes the wheel. I'm not sure, but I think this is the reverser control. It was very easy to install. I then add the regulator handle. I found I needed to apply some pressure to get this all the way on, but I got there in the end. That entire assembly then goes into the cab, as strange as that might seem. There is an arch-shaped guide for this. I didn't get it perfectly in place, but it shouldn't be too noticeable in the end. The crew would probably appreciate somewhere to sit, so why not install the seats next? These easily go over the square guides on the cab floor, though it is a little bit tight to get my fingers in there. I then attach some teeny tiny control wheels to this pipe. This is obviously a little bit fiddly, but not too bad. I have no idea what these are for, steam or water would be a good guess though. I set that aside to dry so I don't just knock the wheels off the pipe right after installing it, and I add the backs of the crew seats. Sitting just isn't enough, they also like to lean back. Such luxury. These parts easily mount into holes in the cab wall. I then add the pipe with the valves. This is about as fiddly as it looks. I made sure the part was connected properly at the top of the cab. There is a mounting hole for it on the floor too, but I don't think I got it exactly in place. In this case, near enough is good enough. Moving on, I install this pair of control-y things. The smaller of the two goes on the left side of the cab. I think these would be used in conjunction with a bar to manipulate the fire grate, maybe, or I might be completely wrong. I wonder if I'm going to get called names by angry train nerds again for not knowing exactly what all of the parts do. I could use the laughs. Either way, these parts were fiddly and I had to nudge them around a fair bit with my knife. I couldn't get my fat fingers in there. Then I glue this gauge onto this control stand, which goes on at a slight angle like so. It's fiddly because it's small, but not too bad. It would be much harder to do if you tried to do this while it was in the cab. I then put that assembly into the cab on the left wall. There's an indentation to guide its positioning, and there's also a hole on the floor for the pipe, but I don't think I got it quite into place again. Then I glue the back wall on. This is obviously easy. It's not very open though, and it seems like a bit of a shame to put so much detail into the cab only to have it hidden. Oh well, I guess there's still windows. I then glue the little venti cover thingy onto the roof. I'm not going to attach the cab roof just now. I'll leave it until after painting, for what I think are obvious reasons. I then install the grab rails next to the door towards the rear. These are easy enough to get into place, though obviously they're quite thin and I would suggest being gentle with them when removing them from the sprue and cleaning them up. The set of rails that go in front of the door have some blocky bits on the end that lock into the notches on the cab wall. I used my knife to force them into place because they were kind of tight. Then it's time to assemble the boiler. I glued this together in sections to try and avoid making too much of a mess. I think it's not a bad idea to glue big things like this together in sections. It can save having to try and get a whole bunch of edges lined up nicely all at once. The boiler went together well enough, though it is a little bit messy. It's not too hard to clean up though. I then glue on the smoke box door. This has a tab to lock it into the correct position, though the fit isn't perfect. There's a slightly inconsistent overhang around the boiler. Not too bad though. I then add this dome. It's not really dome-shaped, but that's what it is anyway. I had to apply quite a bit of pressure to this to get it to sit in place without a big gap. There is still a bit of a gap, but it's certainly better than it could have been. Next comes this, I guess this is also a dome. It's even less dome-shaped than the previous one, but it does fit a little bit better. I still had to apply pressure though. Not that that's really a problem. Then it's chimney time. I glue the base on first, and there's a notch to guide its positioning. The instructions seem to suggest gluing the two parts of the chimney together and then adding it to the boiler, but I figured adding the base and then the chimney part like so would be a better idea. That way I can apply pressure to both joints at the same time. I then glue this rod thing into place here. There isn't anything to guide this really, but you can line it up with the notch at the top of the chimney and try to get it to sit as vertically as you can. I then install what I imagine to be a pair of safety valves. These easily slot into the little square holes above the firebox like so. The little angled bit should be facing backwards. I then joined the cab to the boiler, the rear of the boiler, in case that wasn't obvious. There's another arch-shaped guide here to help you get things lined up good and proper. Not a whole lot to say about that really. Next, this pipe can be glued into place under the cab. I didn't worry too much about cleaning this part up because I figured it won't be super visible. This needs to be done before gluing the boiler and cab assembly to the frame, otherwise you wouldn't be able to put it on. I consult the instructions to see if there's anything I need to install before joining the boiler and frame, and it seems like there isn't anything that can't be done after. The instructions do say to add more details to the boiler, but I chose to add them later in case my pressure applying adventures cause any damage. I joined the upper and lower halves of the engine together. The fit isn't quite perfect. Even after I did a bunch of filing near the firebox and smoke box, it still didn't fit all that well. There are gaps between the support parts on the frame and boiler, but it's good enough. I'm hoping that most of it will be kind of hard to see. Next, I put together this valvey thing, which is quite easy. I set it aside so that I don't immediately knock the wheel out of place when installing it. Then I glue this little thing into place. I think it might be the whistle, otherwise it's some sort of valve. It goes into place very easy. And I follow it with a handrail. There are mounting holes for this and it fits pretty much perfectly. There's pretty much no gap between this and the dome thing. I then put this little box on the side of the firebox. There's a couple of slots in the front of this and they should face towards the front of the engine. I think this is the housing for the reverser gear. I then install the valvey handly thing I put together earlier. The first thing I did was to nudge the handle out of place, because I'm very good at what I do. I did eventually get the assembly into place just in front of the cab, and it was a bit more fiddly than I was expecting it to be. Then comes another valvey pipey thingy. This has a pipe that will go up and over the cab roof, so I left it unglued so there won't be any problems installing the cab roof later on. Then I glued the chimney's lid into place. There's a notch for it to mount onto, and it's pretty easy to put on. I would suggest if you're building this engine too that you leave this off until last. I kept bumping it out of place while working on other parts of the engine, and it was a bit annoying. Then there's a platform that mounts onto the front of the engine. There are two options for this and I've chosen the more simple of the two. I made that choice because the other part had a lot of flashing and I just didn't want to clean it up. After that, I add this box to the front of the cab. There's a square mounting for it which makes this easy. Next it's time for the headlights. There are options for these too. I've chosen these lamps because I thought they looked a bit more interesting than the other choice. There's a little notch on the back of the buffer beam for these to be glued into. It was a little bit fiddly to get them sitting nice and neatly, but I got there after a bit of nudging. And then I add the front coupling. The links on these aren't the best looking because they're solid, but they'll do. This part easily goes into the pocket in the center of the buffer beam. Then I install these tiny little grab rails on the front of the cab. I almost forgot to put these on. Fortunately, I remembered soon enough. Next, I add this thing to the left side of the boiler. I think this is meant to sit flush along the entire side of the boiler, but there is a gap most of the way. I apply pressure to get the best fit I can, and I suppose it could look much worse. Then there's two little valve handles that go onto this rectangular part. These are fairly easy to get into place despite their tiny size. I have no idea what these do, but I would imagine they don't need to be accessed too often while the engine is in motion. Then I build what I think is the water pump. The lower half consists of two parts, and there are tiny knobs to guide the positioning of this, but I found they weren't super effective. Then I glue the upper half into place. I put this on backwards initially, and then I pulled it apart and reversed it off camera. I noticed quick enough that the parts weren't bonded properly. I follow that by adding another hand railing lower on the boiler. This is just as easy to install as the previous hand railing. I'm not entirely sure why they didn't just have us install both hand railings at the same time. Oh well. Moving on, I add this bracket to the lower right side of the boiler here. The back of this is curved so that it should sit flush with the curve of the boiler. Then I install this. I'm pretty sure this is the reversing rod. This was quite fiddly, but the idea is to link this into the inner crank part that I left movable earlier. Once that's connected, I put the other end into the box in the front of the cab with the two slots in it. The part that angles off the main rod should face out from the locomotive at this end, just like I've done here. Then I add glue so that it stays in place, obviously. I'm certainly glad I left that crank so that it could freely move. Then I mount the, I'm still assuming, water pump here. It joins onto the bracket that I installed ages ago that protruded out over the right side of the frame. This was pretty easy to get into place, though I would advise against pushing on the upper section of the pump. You could easily break the two thin bits that hold it together. The more tricky part of this is installing the piping. It connects to the side of the pump like so, and the little brackety bit should be glued onto the side of the dome. There's no guide for that part though. It's not super hard, but it was a little bit fiddly. In the end though, I think it looks good. And now for the absolute worst part of this build. You may know how I feel about rubber band tracks. I don't like them. Well, now I've found something worse. These little rubber hoses, which I think are supposed to be sand lines. In theory, they would be easy to install. You superglue the thick end into the sides of that big box, then the individual hoses run down the side of the boiler and through the bits of the frame. It's cool in theory, but the pipes are not long enough for the little mounting tabs to fit into their holes, and I don't feel like it's a very good idea to stretch them far enough to force them to fit. I stopped caring and decided that near enough is good enough for this. It should be well enough hidden behind the wheels. The worst part about these is they were pretty much impossible to clean up. They're too thin and flexible. That would be okay if they didn't have flash. The one on the right side was okay, but the one on the left is really bad. It was so bad and frustrating to install that I made a bit of a mess with the superglue too. I guess I'm going to have to hide all of that with some weathering or something. My notes about this involve a lot more swearing. I don't understand why anyone would think this is a good material to use for this kind of thing. It's not. It's shit. I would much rather some tiny bits of plastic piping, no matter how fiddly they were. At this point, the model sat for a few days until I was motivated to carry on. I resumed construction by installing these two brackets under the cab. I couldn't get my fingers in there, so tweezers were nice and helpful. Then comes this pipe. You have to kajigger this under the pipe that's already there. Not too hard really, though it might have made more sense to install this before the other pipe. Oh well. I add glue to make sure that it stays in place. Then I add another pipe. I also had to use tweezers here. This one was quite fiddly, and I dropped it a whole bunch of times. At least it looks decent once it's in place. And yet another piece of piping. This one goes on the other side of the engine and runs up from whatever that long hangy downy bit is to above the brake cylinder. Maybe that pipe is part of the braking system. Next comes whatever this thing is. There's a tab that locks it into the slot quite easily, though I have to admit I wasn't entirely sure I'd got this part on properly. Then I make two of whatever these might be called. It's part of the valve gear, and it goes together easily enough. To go with it, I make two of these things. There's nothing to hold these in the correct position, so I had to eyeball it. Once they're done, I glue both assemblies together like so. There's a notch there for the little slidey part to go into. Be sure to pay attention to the labelling on the parts here. They are both different for either side of the engine. These assemblies glue into place here. It is a bit fiddly to get them into place, and the result isn't absolutely perfect, but it's on there and it should work just fine. Well, it won't work, not like an actual valve gear, but it should look okay enough. Of course, do be sure that you've used the correct parts on either side of the engine. Moving on, now is a really good time to start adding wheels. The instructions say to do them one at a time, but I'm going to be a rebel and put the small leading wheels on both sides first, just because. The little nub they mount to holds them relatively straight, but you might still need to give them a bit of a nudge. Then it's time for the driving wheels. There are 5 of these for each side, including one with a bigger counterweight. I sit the drivers in place, making sure that the one with the big counterweight is in the centre. These will thankfully stay in place with friction alone. I didn't want to have to glue them into place right away, because we need to make sure that the quartering is right. All of the wheels on the right side of the engine should have their cranks facing directly downwards. I use the connecting rod to make sure all the wheels are lined up nicely, and then I glue them into place. Once the glue is in place, I remove the side rods so that I can more easily install the brakes. It says to install this later, but I figured it was better to add this now, this being the control rods, I guess, for the brakes. I link this onto the hooked axle thingy that I installed earlier, though it did end up a bit messy. It shouldn't be too visible anyway. Then I add the brake shoes, connecting them to the frame and control rods assembly one by one. This was a little bit fiddly, especially the brake shoe for the frontmost driver, but I did get there eventually, which is nice. It is good to have brakes. I then add the connecting rod for the drivers and glue that into place. There is some slight bending in the part, but I don't think it's too bad. This wouldn't be a problem if the plastic was just a bit harder. The wheels and brakes for the other side go on in exactly the same way, only the drivers have their cranks at the 9 o'clock position and the brake shoes are different parts. I think maybe the rods here were mislabeled. I built this exactly according to the instructions, but according to the diagram, which I probably should have paid a bit more attention to in the first place, I have the connecting rods on the wrong sides, so they look upside down. This would probably greatly upset rivet counters, but I don't feel like it's such a huge deal, and I can't undo it without causing damage. Then, so the crew can climb up into the cab, I glue these ladders to either side of it. There are guide pins here that help get this on nice and straight. Looks very ladder. Then I move back to the front of the engine and install these rods to the front of the drive cylinders. It is a little bit tricky to get these on nice and straight, but it's obviously not the most challenging thing ever. And then I add a pair of grab handles here on the underside of the buffer beam. I'm not sure why that didn't appear earlier in the instructions, but whatever. Next, there's a pair of what seem to be supports for the ladders. There's a couple of mounting holes for these which helped a little bit, but they were still quite fiddly to get into place. Got there in the end though. Now we return to the valve gear. I take the main driving rod and slot it through this brackety thing, but I don't add glue just yet. I slot one end into the cylinder, that's the round bar bit, and I try to join the other end to the connecting rod. It didn't quite fit and bowed out a bit, so I had to trim down the part to allow the bar to go even further into the cylinder. Once I got the parts fit without bending, I glued it all into place. I'm not 100% sure I've got the brackety thing in the exact right place, but it looks fine to me. The part that goes on the other side of the engine goes on in the same way, the only difference being the drive rod is angled down due to the quartering of the wheels. And now for some more even fiddlier rods. These are more thin and therefore prone to being broken, so you can't use too much force when trying to get these into place. Part of this links into the other loose crank that I didn't glue into place way earlier in the build. Once everything was in place, I added glue to all of the contact points, and then it was time to add a crank to the main driving rod and, I assume, reversing gear. It didn't seem to fit properly on the pin for it, so I just trimmed down that pin. This means I had to eyeball its position, but that's not too hard, and the result is okay. Again, the other side of the engine goes together in pretty much the same way. Moving on, I add the walkways to the sides of the engine. There are 2 of these that go on the right side. The forward one goes on easily enough. There are 3 supports for it and it sits in place nicely. The rear one was a bit more fiddly, mostly because it's so flexible, and there wasn't a mount for it at the front to help hold it in place. It's not that hard to get into place though. Once those are on, we can add this box that covers the water pump, if that's actually what it is. It seems a bit odd to hide the pump under this box, but oh well. The walkway for the other side of the engine is a single piece, and it's pretty easy to install. I glued it on in sections so that I wasn't having to apply pressure in a whole bunch of different spots at once. Then there's a pipe which connects to the valvey things on top of the firebox. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be long enough to reach its mounting point on the walkway. I'm not sure if that's because I've done something wrong and got the walkway mounted a bit low, or if the pipe is just a bit too short. Either way, it's kind of annoying. Then I add the headlamp, or a third headlamp anyway. There are two there already, or are they different somehow? Either way, this goes very neatly into the mounting hole on the front of the smoke box. Next I add these little bars. I have no idea what these are for, maybe for mounting flags. There doesn't seem to be any holes for these to mount into, but I just put them on top of the buffer beams here like so. Easy enough. On the underside of the right walkway, I installed this little tank. It's a bit fiddly, but that's why we have tweezers. In front of that we have this bigger tank. This one has piping. The forward section of piping is meant to slot through that hole in the support part. This tank was a bit easier to install than the previous one owing to its size, and it looks pretty neat. Then comes this little bracket thing. I'm guessing this is meant to stop the reversing rod from flexing or something like that, and I used my knife to kajigger it into place. I was actually surprised by how well that worked. The part didn't go flying or anything. Nice. Then we have a piece of piping that goes up front here. There's a couple of mounting points for it and it goes into place fairly easily. A similar piece of piping goes on the left side of the engine. The actual piece of piping itself isn't too hard to get into position, but the little nubbly doohickey things were quite fiddly to position. It might have been a good idea to glue them into place before even installing the walkway. Oh well, hindsight is 20/20 after all. What matters is I got them into place, or close enough. Then I installed this handrail. It goes on much like the other handrails, surprisingly enough. It's not perfect, but it does the job well enough. I wanted to add the smoke shields at the front of the engine. I think they look interesting. The only problem is one of the mounts for these is joined to the step thing that goes under the smoke box door that I didn't use. That may mean that the version of the engine with that kind of step didn't have the shields, but I don't really care, I want them anyway. And there will still be 3 mounting points for them. I glue the mounting bars to the tops of the shields like so. I think I've got them around the right way. I leave them for a little while so the glue can set, and then I glue them into place. There didn't seem to be anything on top of the smoke box to guide these, so I kind of just guessed at where they should go and glued them into place. And with that, the main locomotive part is done. Now it's time to try a little tenderness. Did I make that joke last time I built a locomotive? I don't remember. Anyway, this should be fairly quick. First, I assemble the wheels. We need to make 4 sets of wheels. In case it isn't obvious, the flanges need to be on the inside of the wheel, or it's probably not going to play with the rails very well. I try to get the wheels onto the axle nice and straight, and I do get close, but they're not perfect. I guess it's a good thing that this isn't intended as a rolling model anyway. Then it's time to build the frame of the tender. There was a fair bit of flash on the brake gear of these frames, which was a bit annoying. Once they were cleaned up, I joined the 2 halves with this bar, which was pretty easy. I then attached this rear plate. This goes together easily enough, but the result is kind of flimsy, which I suppose is actually a good thing because it makes it much easier to add the wheels, which is what I do next. There's a pocket that each axle should slot into. The flexibility of this plastic makes that quite easy, so I guess it does have its benefits. Once all the wheel sets are in place, I glue everything together. Then I add these frame parts. These are all pretty much the same. They're not hard to get into place. There is a little bit of bendiness there, but it's very minor and shouldn't be visible at all once the tender body is in place. Once all of these parts are in place, I glue them in to make sure everything is nice and solidly joined together. Then these 2 pieces can go together. There's some H-shaped keying here to help you get them together nicely. It's a bit hard to see the way I've joined them together, but if you're building this yourself, the instructions should show you fairly clearly. That assembly can then slot into the recesses for it at the front of the tender frame like so. I had to file it down a bit to get it to sit flush or close enough to flush with the frame. Then it's time to add some leaf springs. These are pretty easy to slot down into the top of the wheel holdy bearing box things. That's the technical term, by the way. There are 4 of these and they're all numbered differently. To avoid mix-ups, I cut them from the sprue and installed them one at a time. Then it's time to build the structure of the tender. This is pretty simple. The bottom should go on with the little lip facing upwards and at the rear of the tender. I had to file down the floor because it was a bit too long to fit inside of the body. Eventually though, it went into place nicely. I then decided that it was time to join the frame assembly to the rest of the tender. It's a bit earlier than the instructions say, but what are they going to do to stop me? There are some slots on the bottom of the tender body that will line up with the few raised rectangular bits on the frame. I did have to expand those holes a bit to get the parts to fit, but after that the parts go together nicely, though a little pressure was needed to make sure the bond was good and has minimal gaps. Next comes the rear wall of the coal bunker. This is clearly just a simple flat piece that sits here. Not too challenging. I test fit with the coal and discover that I'll need to file it down just a little bit. I do that and then it fits nicely. The only problem is that it's a little bit flat. I'll probably add some extra coal to this before I paint it. Now for one more rubber piece. You can see the raggedy bits at the bottom of this where I've made a mess trying to remove some flash. I guess at least this ring part is easy enough to place and it fits properly, much less frustrating than those annoying sand pipes. Still, this is a bad material and I don't think it should be used. I then place this box on the tender's right. There's some keying for this and it's very easy to place. These two square boxes can then go on either side in the center. These should be placed with the hinges on the bottom side. I have no idea what these boxes are for, maybe tools for the tender, who knows. I guess the people who worked on these engines knew, but they haven't told me, so I don't know. Next, there's some wooden boards that surround the top of the coal hopper so that more coal can be held. These were a bit messy looking and needed some cleanup, but I think that kind of helps with the wooden look. Nothing too tricky about placing these. They go all around the top of the hopper. Good times. I then add these, I think they're lamps. These go onto this box thing that will go onto the rear of the tender. There was a choice between these and some circular lamps. You need to cut out the mounting holes for these whichever choice you made, so in my case rectangular slots. Mine were a bit messy but they won't be seen anyway. I add some glue to bond the lights into place and then while it's drying I add the rear buffer beam. For some reason this is a single piece, unlike the one on the front of the engine. At any rate it's easy enough to get into place. I then add the rear box thing, with the lamps and such. It seemed like this should line up with the buffer beam. It doesn't really have anything else to guide it though. Then I add this piece of pipe to the side of the tender like so. You can see it has a tab that should go into the hole in the side of the bunker here. I only add glue at the top of this so that the part can flex and move to join with the next piece of pipe. This one is a bit longer, and it mounts into a few holes at the bottom of the tender, on one side of the frame and the pipe I previously added. I also glue it to some of the frame parts to eliminate the bend in the pipe. Then I add the details that go onto the buffer beam. These are the same as on the front of the engine. That is to say, these two air hoses, buffers which have the same flat and slightly rounded buffer, this time the flat buffer being on the right side, which would be the same side as the front of the engine if you looked at them side by side. Does anyone know why they had their buffers like that? Let me know in the comments below. Of course, couplers are also needed if the locomotive is going to haul anything. These are just as easy as on the front. They've also got the same flat chains, but they'll do. Then I install a pair of ladders on the rear of the tender. These go into the mounting holes quite easily, though they don't seem to want to sit perfectly straight. They look okay though. Finally, I add the rear headlamp for when the engine is running tender first. Again, this is just as simple to install as the one on the front of the engine. And with that, the locomotive portion of the kit is complete, or as complete as I'm going to make it. There is a pin that you can use to join the engine and tender together, but I feel like it's a better idea to leave them separate, at least until they're painted. Now it's time to build the display base. I'm assuming these track sets are not unique to this kit. Them coming with their own instruction sheet would suggest that. You get 4 sections of track here, and that's way too much for just this locomotive. In fact, you could fit it on 2 pieces. To put this together, you start with the roadbed and sleeper parts, which have little clips and poles on the underside. I clip them together and add glue so they stay together. I figure it's probably a good idea to sit these on a flat surface while you're waiting for the glue to set. I glue 3 sections of the roadbed together and then clip the end parts on. I rather like that the end parts are included. It kind of makes it look like a museum display. Once that's done, I can add the rails. These are shaped like real rail, obviously, and the flat part should be on the bottom. The rail can then be slid into place under the clippy bits. Nothing too tricky about that. I get the 3 rails in place on one side and then I start gluing it together. I apply glue at each joint in the rail and along most of the clips. To finish it off, I add these track joiners. I think they may also be called fish plates for some reason. These seem easy enough. You put one on each side of each rail joint. I wasn't paying attention and didn't realize it at first, but they're different parts for the inside and outside of the rail, and I managed to mix those up. I didn't realize until after I had glued them on, so some of them are probably wrong, but it looks fine to me and that's what matters. Most of the inner ones are going to be hidden by the engine anyway, so I'm sure I can deal with it. Placing the engine onto the track, I discovered that the tender will happily sit on the track nicely, but the locomotive itself, not so much. That's a bit disappointing, but I'm sure it'll be fine once I glue it down, but that won't be until after the painting. Also, it's worth noting that the way I built this, the leading wheel was a bit too high, so I broke the part that was holding it up and bent it downwards so that the wheel would be a bit more sensible. That is to say, not hovering in the air above the railhead. So that's the Hobby Boss German Kriegslokomotive BR52 in 1/72nd scale completed. Unfortunately, the display base was a bit too long to fit onto my turntable and still have it rotate, and the engine doesn't properly sit on the tracks anyway, so here it is without the base. I think this is a pretty cool model. It was a bit of a challenge to build, but it was a fun challenge, and I'm mostly happy with the result. Mostly. The rubber sandpipes on this are really quite awful, and I think they detract quite a bit from an otherwise very nice model. Especially the one on the left side of the engine, which I just couldn't remove the flashing from. I had such trouble getting them into place, and there's that big superglue mess there too. Why couldn't these be plastic like the rest of the model? Did the designer see all of those tank kits out there with the horrible rubber band tracks and decide that they should just do them one better? Or one worse, I guess? Do they have some kind of mental impairment? What I'm trying to say is I really hate that rubbery material. If it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have any real complaints. I mean, this was a challenging kit and I would still have things I don't like, but they wouldn't be serious complaints. Oh well, aside from that, this was a quite fun build. It was definitely not a quick one afternoon build though, and I spent quite a few hours on this. Worth it in my opinion. The finished product is quite nice. That said, I don't think I'll be doing something this complicated again for a while. The detail is pretty good. Not that I'm an expert on German locomotives or anything, but I think it looks fairly accurate. It's got just about everything I can imagine you'd want in a static model of a locomotive, though maybe including a few crew figures would have been nice. You could probably find some aftermarket crew if you really wanted them, but I don't think I want them that much. There are of course a few flaws. Probably the biggest one I can think of is the front of the cab having some ejector pin markings on it. Also, the chains on the couplings are just flat solid ovals. It's a bit annoying, but it could be worse. And I'm pretty sure this model will mostly be viewed from the side, which does reduce the visibility of those things. Either way, it's still a fairly decent kit. If you like German steam locomotives and you want a static model of one with a bit of challenge to building it, I would recommend this kit. Clearly you're not going to be able to put this on a model railway and drive it around, but I still think it's pretty cool. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments section below, and if you haven't already, why not sub here on YouTube, join my excellent community on Discord, follow me on social media, or watch me stream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, or perhaps by purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description below. And of course, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.